a tremendous tariff on lumber and things as such, and yet we don't need their lumber. We have more lumber than they do. We don't need Canada's lumber.
Provide a little bit more lumber within their supply, but there's no way that they can replace the imports coming from Canada.
Canada does not dump lumber into the United States, and we will continue to make the case that these current and proposed duties are unjustified.
When Donald Trump declared that the United States no longer needed lumber or car from Canada, many dismiss it as another burst of political rhetoric. But the announcement soon materialized into a sweeping policy shift. Tariffs were imposed almost overnight, with Washington labeling Canadian lumber a national security concern. The move sent shockwaves through the market. Lumber prices surged past $650 per thousand board feet, triggering a chain reaction that rippled through the construction industry. For home builders, the consequences were immediate and painful. Project that once promised profit was suddenly weighed down by inflated material costs, forcing contractors to pause, scale back, or abandon their plans altogether. This single decision hit at the very core of the American housing market. The United States relies heavily on Canadian lumber. Nearly a third of the wood used to build homes comes from abroad, and most of that from its northern neighbor. By taxing this critical supply, the administration turned a political stance into an economic disruption. Builders hesitated, supply chains strained, and families faced rising home prices that put ownership increasingly out of reach. Experts warned that each jump in construction costs would exclude millions of Americans from the dream of buying a home. What was meant to protect domestic jobs and industries had instead destabilized one of the country's most vital economic pillars. The numbers painted a stark picture. Canada supplies roughly 12 billion board feet of softwood lumber to the U.S. every year, around a quarter of total national demand. Even if every American sawmill operated non-stop, domestic production would still fall short by more than 3 billion board feet. Industry analysts had long cautioned that replacing Canada's role in the lumber supply chain wasn't a challenge that could be solved overnight. Even with massive investments, new mills, and an expanded workforce, it could take up to a decade for the U.S. to close the gap, and that projection assumed ideal conditions. Reality told a different story. Most American mills already operate near capacity, running at about 95% efficiency while dealing with outdated machinery, labor shortages, and tight margins. As tariffs took hold, those vulnerabilities became visible across the housing market. Lumber costs rose faster than wages. Contractors found themselves squeezed, and builders paid more for every plank and beam. The ripple extended far beyond construction sites. Rising input costs inflated home prices nationwide, slowing new housing starts and squeezing an already undersupplied market. Families who had been on the cusp of homeownership found themselves priced out entirely. What began as an attempt to prioritize American industry had become an obstacle to broader economic stability. Each surge in lumber costs amplified inflationary pressures that touched everything from mortgage rates to consumer spending. The policy that was supposed to strengthen the nation's industrial backbone ended up deepening divides within its housing system. Independent from Canadian imports, once framed as strength, now appeared more like strain. It exposed how deeply interconnected the U.S. and Canadian economies truly were. While the United States wrestled with the consequences of its tariffs, Canada charted a different course. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government avoided direct retaliation and instead pursued adaptation. Ottawa unveiled a $500 million initiative designed to help lumber producers diversify export markets and reduce reliance on American buyers. Not long after, another $1.22 billion package followed. This one aimed at shielding the industry from anti-dumping duties and strengthening its international competitiveness. British Columbia's Minister of Forests, Ravi Palmer, outlined an ambitious goal: redirect at least 10% of lumber exports toward new global destinations. The plan wasn't driven by confrontation, but by reinvention. Canadian leaders framed the tariffs not as a threat, but as an opportunity, a chance to reimagine how their forestry sector could compete globally. For decades, provinces like British Columbia and Alberta had built their economies around steady U.S. demand. Now, with that stability shaken, they began transforming their approach. The government invested heavily in modernization, offering innovation grants, launching trade missions, and upgrading infrastructure to streamline exports. What could have been an economic setback instead ignited a wave of renewal. Canadian lumber producers began expanding their reach. strengthening ties with markets eager for dependable suppliers. As the U.S. tightened its borders, Canada opened its own. The shift was striking. For nearly half a century, about 90% of Canadian lumber exports had gone directly to the United States. That reliance had seemed permanent. But the disruption pushed producers to look outward, and new markets responded enthusiastically. Shipments began flowing to South Korea, Vietnam, India, Australia, the United Kingdom, and emerging markets across the Middle East and North Africa. Japan, once a minor player in Canada's export portfolio, boosted its lumber imports by roughly 26% in early 2024, evidence that buyers abroad viewed Canada as a stable and trusted partner amid global uncertainty. These new trade relationships soon expanded into formal agreements. Deals with Germany, South Korea, and other nations opened doors for sustained growth and diversified revenue streams. Canadian forestry companies and port authorities, especially in Vancouver and Prince Rupert, poured millions into upgrading facilities and expanding capacity to handle the surge in overseas trade. Every shipment that left Canadian shores represented more than economic recovery. It symbolized a shift in national identity. Canada was no longer just America's supplier. It was a confident global player, poised to compete across continents. Meanwhile, the United States continued to feel the weight of its own policy choices. Builders in states like Texas, Ohio, and Florida reported mounting frustration as costs escalated and projects stalled. Housing developers delayed or canceled construction plans, unable to balance budgets under the strain of higher prices. The shortage of affordable homes deepened, intensifying social and economic divides. What had started as an effort to revive domestic industry was now eroding the foundation of American housing stability. In the end, the contrasting outcomes of the two nations told a larger story about adaptation and interdependence. The United States, in seeking self-reliance, uncovered the fragility of its domestic capacity and the limits of isolationist economics. Canada, faced with the same crisis, turned it into momentum, diversifying, modernizing, and redefining its role in the global marketplace. The episode revealed not only how intertwined the two economies were, but also how differently nations could respond when those ties were tested. One chose confrontation, the other chose transformation. And in that choice lay the difference between disruption and reinvention. The National Association of Homebuilders estimated that every 1% increase in lumber costs added roughly $1,000 to the price of a new home. When lumber prices surged toward $765 per thousand board feet, the result was an extra $10,000 tacked onto the cost of an average house, with no improvement in materials or quality. For families already struggling to enter the housing market, that rise pushed the dream of homeownership even further out of reach. Across Western Canada, sawmills began to adapt. Rather than relying solely on raw exports, producers embraced modernization and began focusing on higher-value products such as engineered wood, cross-laminated timber, and precision-cut building components. This shift reflected a deliberate strategy: move up the value chain, compete on innovation rather than sheer volume, and build a more resilient industrial foundation. Each new trade deal signed abroad carried significance beyond economics. It symbolized Canada's emerging place in the global market, a country redefining itself not through dependence on one dominant customer, but through diversification, sustainability, and strategic growth. Meanwhile, the situation in the United States was deteriorating. Lumber prices continued to climb, creating a domino effect across the construction sector. Builders faced mounting material costs, banks grew cautious about financing new developments, and contractors struggled to balance their budgets. Projects that had once been profitable became financially untenable. Across the nation, housing development slowed or came to a halt, while potential homeowners watched as prices rose beyond their reach. The foundation of the American housing dream, a cornerstone of the nation's identity, was showing cracks. As domestic mills failed to fill the widening supply gap, the U.S. construction industry entered a period of uncertainty. The administration's tariffs, initially framed as a path toward economic self-sufficiency, were now contributing to rising inflation and stagnant housing supply. Each delay, each canceled project, represented more than just an economic setback. It was a reflection of a policy that had backfired. The push for independence had exposed how interconnected modern economies truly are. In contrast, Canada's evolution represented something far greater than economic recovery. It marked a shift in global influence. As the world faced unstable supply chains, environmental challenges, and rising geopolitical tensions, the value of dependability grew exponentially. Canada's reputation as a reliable and sustainable supplier became one of its most powerful assets. International partners began turning to Ottawa not just for resources, but for long-term partnerships in construction, green infrastructure, and renewable materials. Dependability had become a quiet form of power, an edge that allowed Canada to strengthen its role on the global stage while others were still struggling to adapt. Back in Washington, the tone began to change. The same officials who had once praised tariffs as proof of American strength were now facing a growing wave of criticism from builders, economists, unions, and consumers alike. The policy that was supposed to protect domestic jobs had instead made the system more fragile. High construction costs, labor shortages, and stagnant production created a cycle of inefficiency that the nation could not easily escape. The conversation in political circles began to shift, from defending protectionism to questioning its long-term sustainability. The goal of defending American industry had quietly transformed into a struggle against the very consequences of its own strategy. The results of this economic experiment were visible across the continent. Unfinished neighborhoods dotted suburban landscapes. Infrastructure projects lagged behind schedule. Housing shortages deepened, fueling social frustration and economic inequality. Meanwhile, north of the border, Canada was emerging stronger. By diversifying trade and investing in modernization, it had turned economic pressure into an opportunity for growth. Once seen as a smaller partner in the lumber equation, Canada now held an undeniable advantage. For the first time in decades, Canada's economic identity was no longer defined by its proximity to the U.S. market. It was forging its own path,